Hello, this is Andrea Brownstein, Chair of the Board of New Creation International, here to introduce to you David Marshak, who is our speaker today. David was educated at Harvard, studied for many years the philosophies of Rudolf Steiner and Sri Aurobindo. He has been a consultant with schools across the country. He founded the Self-Design Graduate Institute, which helps people generate ideas for themselves as they go through their own educational professions. David, welcome. Glad to have you here. The goal of this particular video is to talk about encouraging engagement in children. Particularly in a time when schools are out, parents and teachers who are trying to educate at a distance have that question to fulfill every day. So David, I hope you could start us off by talking about how you see and how you can frame how to encourage engagement in children of all ages.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Andrea. Happy to be here and to talk a little bit about this topic. So for me, the notion of engagement, the experience of engagement, always starts from some kind of motivation. Motivation comes from within. You can't really motivate other people effectively. Perhaps you can motivate them in negative ways for short times, but if we really want particularly children and youth to engage in learning, that kind of fear-based, threat-based motivation is counterproductive. So what we're interested in then is what is productive. And for me, I like to start with enthusiasm. This is a word we don't use enough. One of my former colleagues and friends, Brent Cameron, wrote a good deal about and talked about enthusiasm as a core quality for learning. And I think that that's a really helpful use of this concept, enthusiasm. So when we're enthusiastic, we're engaged. It goes without saying. So what is it that drives enthusiasm? What is it that nurtures it? And what nurtures enthusiasm is curiosity, is genuine interest, is development of capacity, development of skills to be able to do things more effectively in the world, inquiry, real inquiring into something. These are all experiences that can generate enthusiasm. And then enthusiasm often generates itself. You get enthusiastic about something, you get involved in it, it's self-rewarding. And that's one of the qualities about the real motivation for learning, is that the reward comes from the learning itself. Of course, we have school systems that don't operate to a large extent in that way. There's enormous amount of research, and Alfie Kohn has written about this. I think he has several books where he goes through the research again and again and again that shows that self-motivation is powerful, and that actually, over time, external rewards for learning make people less interested in learning. That there's a negative field that goes in there. So that's where I would start. I'd start with enthusiasm, and then the questions of how do we find that encouragement for children and youth to become enthusiastic.
I think that is a beautiful summary of it. I want to tell a short story. You can edit this out if you want to. I have a 5-year-old grandson, and he is fascinated with the blenders and spice mills that my daughter has, so much that he unlocked the kitchen cabinet, Woke her up the other morning about 6 o'clock saying he needed to grind something. He's on a tear to make a machine of some sort that can be a robot or a car or something. And he said, today I need to grind 4 eggs. And she said, so this is what she says. She says, well, I convinced him that if he wanted to grind 4 eggs, that he wanted to be a cook. He's also interested in cooking. So I said, cooks make recipes. So what do you think? We'll make a recipe. So he got out a piece of paper and some markers, and he drew a garlic. He wanted 4 garlics, 2 oranges, 4 eggs, and a half an apple. And he wrote it all out. He could barely write, but he wrote it all out. And then she convinced him that what he wanted to do was make a marinade. So they did that. And maybe they don't need all those eggs. They could use 2 for an aioli. And then she had 2 egg whites left over, and she said, you know, we could make a meringue out of this. So they had frozen strawberries, more grinding, and he ground those up, and he was really happy about that. So she said, essentially, she convinced him that what he wanted to do was a good thing. He just needed a little bit of refining. So she said, we had marinated pork chops, which were pretty good, except I'm going to kind of try to convince him to use a lot less cinnamon next time. So I hadn't thought about that. That happened just recently, but in your description of how to locate enthusiasm and broaden it out, well, this was a sort of a natural experiment. I'm going to have to tell her about it, about what you said. So I guess what I'm leading up to is saying, what kind of cues, advice, or strategies can you offer for parents who are home with their kids to sort of harness that, whatever enthusiasm, recognize it for one thing, recognize the enthusiasm, and then harness it for some pleasure that the kid can find. So I'm sure you've done this before.
So there are 2 principles that I could identify in your story. So the first principle is that, you know, we know that young children, young meaning 3, 4, 5, 6 or so, are often enthusiastic about different kinds of explorations of the material world. And so too often what we do is we see the unrealistic elements in them, and we use the unrealistic elements to shut down the whole exploration.
Right.
And that's very counterproductive if we want children to really be in touch with their own curiosity. So in this case, there was a particular kind of vein of curiosity, which is, again, very common for 5-year-olds.
Right, right.
And what your daughter did was the second principle, which is really to engage in a dialogue with her son. And I use the word dialogue very, very intentionally, because a dialogue is something that takes place between people to a large extent with equal power. And this was a negotiation, a dialogue. Your daughter was certainly engaging in ways of shaping the experience so that the outcome would be more positive.
Right. But we didn't have eggs all over the kitchen.
Right. But she also basically respected and worked with the fundamental enthusiasm. And that's the key in the engagement. And, you know, one of the complexities in this is that the need for adult involvement will vary dramatically. Because sometimes even very young children can come up with, you know, natural experiments that don't need a whole lot of adult engagement.
Right.
And the key thing is to provide a physically safe environment in which they can conduct the experimental activities, or the inquiry or whatever, because that may always be an issue with young children. And then there are other kinds of this example where there was some need. In order to have some kind of positive outcome, there was a need to have a dialogue and to have elements of the experience, you know, reorganized. But as you tell the story, I hear this was done, again, as a negotiation, as a conversation, as a dialogue, not as an authoritarian imposition. And then the last thing I would say about it right now is that, you know, one of the complexities of parenting, of course, is that the needs of a 5-year-old and the needs of a 9-year-old, the needs of a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old are very, very different. And so parents, the principle is the same, which is to honor and support the enthusiastic inquiry of the child or youth, but to do it in a way that, first of all, maintains safety. The safety needs are very different. And then secondly, that engages in structuring the experience to make a positive outcome more likely, but to do that only as needed, not to interject the parent's control, the parent's authority, where it's not needed.
Right.
And of course, these are difficult judgments. It's easy for me to say, you know, and parents are not always going to get it exactly right, and that's fine. Inevitably, parenting, you know, is not about perfection. It's about getting it right more often than not.
Right.
And so but the key thing in this is the principle of bringing together the respect for the enthusiasm, the recognition of the need for safety, and then the monitoring of the amount of parental engagement that's really optimal.
Right. Sounds great to me. I was delighted to hear you refer to Alfie Kohn, because I read his Punished by Rewards a long time ago. And I know that shaped my sense of teaching. I'm wondering what you could recommend to parents at home or teachers at distance for about the summer that we're facing, which will be both totally unfamiliar and totally familiar at the same time. The question has come to me as a recovering college counselor: how can my kid use this summer well so it doesn't interfere with his future whatever? I think that's a combination of different kinds of anxiety. But since we have a lot of open time, what kinds of things would you tell parents about regarding how they can best manage their lives and preserve their children's autonomy and engagement?
Well, this is, of course, a challenge, and more so the older that the child gets.
Right.
As a parent, you know, I don't necessarily want my 16-year-old staying up to 4 in the morning and sleeping all day. But there's also a cost to interfering with that pattern. And so I'm not going to try, that's such a complex issue, I'm going to leave that for the moment.
Okay.
The general principle is really one of the qualities of supporting enthusiasm is that there's a possibility for things to come up, projects to come up, activities to come up that take an enormous amount of time. So I'll give you an example, I can give two examples. One actually from my own life was that in the summer between 4th grade and 5th grade, or maybe 5th grade and 6th grade, a friend and I, you know, we've been playing this board game Risk, which is about, you know, international aggression, basically, and has all these various, and we thought it was pretty lame after a while. So we decided that we would invent a better game. And we spent, you know, a month and a half, you know, we had this set out on a ping pong table in my basement, and you know, we built board games, we rebuilt board games, but basically we spent, you know, hundreds of hours.
Right.
You know, and we did build a better game, although, you know, we didn't commercialize it. That didn't even occur to us at the time. But the quality of engagement, you know, you know, some young folks or many young folks are engaged in physical activities, obviously, and there certainly are, you know, there are athletics that you can do that don't involve, you know, you don't need to get within 6 feet. So that's also something that people can do. So, you know, it's that quality, you know, you don't necessarily want to find things that arbitrarily suck up a lot of time if they're arbitrary.
Right.
But when young people are enthusiastic, when people of any age are enthusiastic about something, they become willing to devote a great deal of time to it. So another example I can give, which is not in a summer, but I think illustrates the principle, is that when my stepdaughter, I think was 6 or I guess she was 6 or 7, we had a split level ranch, and so downstairs we had a big playroom. And the deal was, I think, that she could leave stuff up in the playroom. She only had to clean up once a week or something like that.
Yeah.
because she was the primary user of the playroom, she and her friends. And they got into, I think I taught them how to do this, to take playing cards and build structures, and playing cards are slippery, and
Yep.
getting that third level is really tricky. And she and her friends really got into this. And, for a number of weeks, we went, I don't know how many boxes of playing cards I bought. The structures got bigger and bigger and higher, and things would fall down. They'd have to rebuild them. And, it had the quality of enthusiasm. And, I thought this was an activity, there was a little bit of obsessive quality to it, but it was really good hand-eye coordination.
Yep.
It was really good balance, practice. And then, the notion, they began building these extravagant buildings that were far beyond anything I had ever imagined. I mean, in my childhood with playing cards. So again, there was this quality of, I'm reluctant to say the word, but I'll sort of architectural imagination. It was really interesting watching the aesthetic of what they were doing. And this went on for weeks and then, the day came, and then it was done.
Yeah.
They were no longer, they moved on to something else. And, so anyway, the quality of engagement that human beings have at any age, we see this in adults all the time, that it's a question of, does it fit into life in a positive way? And of course, there can always be, a kind of obsessiveness that's not desirable.
Well, yeah, and we all recognize in ourselves those moments when that takes a grip. Your introductory comment reminded me of something I heard from a friend of mine who's a teacher, who's teaching remotely her US history courses and European history courses, and has a 7-year-old child at home. And she, early on, when the school first was closed, said, I made a schedule. So we got in the morning, we're going to have breakfast, and then we're going to have school for the kid, and then I'm going to do my classes, and then he can do X. So she had this very elaborate schedule made up, which of course collapsed in 2 days. It just made her crazy. There was a huge amount of stress in her talking about how hard it was to just acknowledge you can't have what you're used to having. You can't have this schedule, you can't have a structure and make it work while you have a full-time job as well. Advice for people listening in for how to come to terms with the fact that you get to wholesomeness and wholeness some other way?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I don't, since I'm not experiencing that, I don't have children at home right now, and I don't have a full-time job at the moment either. I'm not experiencing that stress. And I think that it will be fascinating, when we come out of this period, which has to happen at some point. And I imagine there will be social psychologists who are studying this.
Oh, yeah.
And that will learn a great deal about it, that this has really been an enormous experiment for millions of people. And I would imagine that there's a whole array of how well people have found themselves able to live with it. And I would expect that there are many, many, many positive manifestations for people, as well as negative manifestations. But what exactly they are, I don't know.
I can only say that in her case and in my daughter's case, both sets of parents have capitulated to, okay, screen time could be okay in a limited way. They're both people who said, we don't need screen time because we've got music and we have art and we have all these other things. But there's a managerial quality to that. So.
Well, again, my own orientation to parenting and any particular experience is that along with enthusiasm and kind of openness for the kinds of activities that are generative and engaging, that there also needs to be moderation or activities that have the potential, to really become addictive.
Right.
But that could be really different for different people because, for example, you could have someone who's basically a 12-year-old filmmaker, and there would be a lot of screen time, but it's creative screen time, or people who are composing music, on their iPads. I mean, that's a certain kind of screen time. So I think it requires just discrimination about what the screen time is. And then the other thing I would say about that, if there are parents who want to raise children without screens, I'm not someone who would be disrespectful of that choice. My own choice is really that we live in a screen world, and I would rather have my children have access to it in moderation.
Right.
And I think also there's enormous differences at different ages. And, the question is really the most harmful aspects of screen time in excess are for children under the age of 6 or 7.
Right.
And once you get beyond that, you can really get into the issue of addictive behavior, but it's not likely to be damaging to brain development in the way that it would be for 2, 3, 4-year-olds. And I know the American Academy of Pediatricians have backed off from their no screen time before 2, but I would stay with the minimal screen time before 2 myself, and then moderation in the next 5, 6 years. And so
I would add to that, because I want to lead into a slightly different question, that the parents need to limit their screen time in front of their kids because kids are always watching.
Well, right. That's the fundamental question, which is that the moment you get into, do as I say, not as I do, you're inviting trouble.
You've already got it. You've already got it.
Right. You're inviting, conflict.
Right.
And then when kids get older, they learn the H word, which is hypocrisy. So so that's a challenge. And I mean, I would imagine that there are parents now who are working from home, whose jobs require them to be on screen 6 hours or 8 hours a day. And so, but I think that's something that's really different than the example I've seen this cited where, the family goes out to dinner and both of the parents are on their phones.
Right.
I mean, that's a very different thing than parents who are working on a screen and that's their job. And you can explain that distinction to kids. Kids understand that.
Absolutely. And jobs are allowed to have breaks. You're not supposed to be glued all the time. So this brings me around I want to pick up on something you started with, which I'm keying off of the respect for enthusiasm and the idea that it's a dialogue, not an order, not a fiat. It strikes me as what you're really talking about is active listening. You should be really looking at what's underneath the question, where the ideas are coming from. And frankly, earlier today, Lakshmi and I were talking about other topics, and she said that one thing she thought would be really helpful would be to talk about how to help parents and teachers really listen to kids, not just hear a request and make a decision about it, not just say, send me a list, I'll figure it out. It always struck me when I was teaching that it was heartbreaking how little it took to engage a kid because they're dying to be heard, they're dying to be listened to. But I don't know how to tell people what that feels like or what that looks like. So you're up.
Well, the pioneer in paying attention to children's experience and listening was Maria Montessori.
Got it.
And, Montessori set up her classrooms in such a way that the environment was set up by the teacher in a age appropriate way.
Mhm.
And then the teacher's job was primarily to watch the children, to observe, and then to listen. And it's the same principle, which is, do we as teachers or parents really stop talking and listen and watch? One of the ways that this has been articulated, again, in the context of the work that Brent Cameron did and his colleagues with self-design in British Columbia, was something they call observing for listening. And observing for listening observing for learning. And observing for learning is exactly the same thing that Montessori talked about, it's a formalized title. But that notion of paying attention. So, as a parent, you only have presumably one child you're interacting with at a time, or maybe two. I don't know. You could have more, I guess. But it's that quality that you listen to them and observe. How often do parents actually just stop and watch their child play?
Right.
And it doesn't need to be for long. I mean, it could be for 10 minutes. But 10 minutes is a long time if you're not talking as a parent, and if you're watching. And then in the classroom, of course, you have to set up your classroom in a project-based way so that the students are engaged in doing something. And then when you do that, then you can observe them. And again, it's a question of, it's not all or nothing, but it's something that can be done for a period of time. But the quality of this is that it's really the best way for the adult to really learn what's going on with the child or the teen, because otherwise we're too busy telling them what to do.
Yeah. And I think that you've hit on something really crucial. You have to want to learn something, out of whatever you're observing.
Mm-hmm.
Another story, my daughter was in the 4th grade and she had a birthday party. And she invited all the girls in her class. So maybe there were 13 girls. And at that age, mothers are always in conflict about Barbie dolls. But she had a Barbie doll, which she later turned into Motorcycle Barbie with tattoos on it. But that's another story. Gives you a flavor of her. So they all brought their Barbie dolls. And I watched them maybe for 40 minutes or so. And they would gather together in groups of 2 or 3. And they would have little play Barbie things. And then all of a sudden things would erupt into anger or frustration, or they just throw their hands up and they would quit. And then they would regroup in other groups and they'd play for about 10 minutes and then they would explode again. It was hilarious. And I thought, you can really have a sense of interplay and dynamics with something that they can represent with each other. I have no idea what they were saying to each other, but it was absolutely a ebb and flow of activity that had a pattern to it. So I quit having an opinion about Barbies. They were useful. I'm looking at the time. It's about 30 minutes in. So I'd like to know, first of all, are there any other comments you'd like to make or topics you want to bring up that we've missed? Or
Well, the one other reference that I want to make in this context is to this concept of flow. And
yes.
Some of you may be familiar with this since there's been a certain amount of publicity in the mainstream about this. There's a psychologist, and I'm going to give a version of his name. It's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And
yes,
of course, it's not
true.
spelled that way, but he's, I think, in his early 80s now.
Yeah.
But he has really brought this concept of flow into the culture. He studied it and written about it, done research about it, and popularized it. And the concept of flow is that when you are in the zone, which is another language that some people have used, you're really, all of your attention is going into whatever that activity is. And there's a certain experience of timelessness. There's an experience of profound engagement. There's a profound motivation to continue with what you're doing. And it's the kind of experience that athletes describe, artists describe, all the time. And all creative people describe this kind of experience. But it's really, the point I want to make is that this is available to everyone. This is the experience that young children have all the time, particularly when we're trying to get them to come to lunch or dinner or get in the car and they don't want to do it. That part of the reason is that they're in the flow state and they're just really comfortable being where they are. So the awareness of this is that I think it's really useful for parents,
Right.
particularly to be aware that this is something where their child might be experiencing it. And, obviously sometimes you have to get the kid in the car and go. I understand that. Or it's dinner time, come to the table. It's not that there aren't boundaries in the world. Of course there
Right.
are. And children need to learn how to live with them. But when there's not an external boundary, and the child is in the flow state or the teen is in the flow state, really being aware of that, respectful of it,
Right.
and allowing the continuation of it, because the flow state is a really positive state because it really integrates, for the most part, the creative, the intellectual, and the emotional aspects of the person.
I love Csikszentmihalyi's work. I read it a long time ago. And I think anybody who has ever experienced flow struggles to get back to it or works to get back to it some way, because it's so calming and fulfilling. Do you think? I can't tell you how much I appreciate your comments. I want to make sure that people don't miss something that you didn't quite throw away but needs signaling. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time. You do what you can because you're listening, you're active, you have your own human experiences. Teddy Roosevelt said, do what you can with what you have with where you are. And that is good enough under these times, under any times. David, thanks a lot. I hope we'll have another conversation soon.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you, and I'm sure we'll talk again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.